It wasn't my plan to talk about Trump and America this week, but then I didn't have the president-elect refusing to count out using military force to take over Greenland on my bingo card. So let's have a look at this. It all comes from an extended press conference held by President-elect Trump earlier in the week. Trump was asked if he could assure the world that as he tried to get control of Greenland and the Panama Canal, maybe even Canada, that he wasn't going to use military or economic coercion. And for the first two of those, his answer to that was no.
You're talking about Panama and Greenland. No, I can't assure you on either of those two. But I can say this, we need them for economic security. Well, we need Greenland for national security purposes. I've been told that for a long time, long before I even ran. I mean, people have been talking about it for a long time. You have approximately 45,000 people there. People really don't even know if Denmark has any legal right to it.
Yeah, they kind of do, though. The US signed a declaration back in 1916 recognising Denmark's sovereignty over the whole of Greenland, which had been the status quo for centuries.
But if they do, they should give it up because we need it for national security. That's for the free world. I'm talking about protecting the free world.
Ah, that old, we might invade your country in the name of freedom, jape. But at least if you're Canada, Trump has been prepared to rule out the use of military force there. When a reporter asked, when you say you're considering military force to acquire Panama and Greenland, are you also considering military force to annex and acquire Canada?
No, economic force. Because Canada and the United States, that would really be something. You get rid of that artificially drawn line, and you take a look at what that looks like, and it would also be much better for national security.
Well, that's all right then. Just economic force. Now, it wasn't long ago I was saying that as Trump term number 2 kicks off, let's focus on what the president does, not just what he says. Because, as we know, he says all sorts of stuff. Some of it just for effect. Some of it to establish an extreme position to be negotiated back from. Some of it just because he likes trolling his opponents. And add to that the fact that a lot of what he says is often ambiguous at best, and you have to watch the original rather than be influenced by the mainstream media reporting of it, where they go to put the worst possible interpretation on his words, which is the act of campaigners rather than the reporters, but that's the world we live in. Now, that didn't happen in this case. He unambiguously said what he said. Let's start with the positive. When it comes to Greenland specifically, Trump is identifying an absolutely genuine and crucial security issue that, while others have discussed it in the abstract in the past, has failed to be grasped with the seriousness that it merits. Had Trump wanted to start his presidency on day one with an immediate sense of bringing proactive leadership back to the free world, as against the machinations of the autocracies, specifically Russia and China, this would absolutely be one area to do that. It's just unfortunate that where it seems as though the win was just waiting there for him, at extremely low cost comparatively, he couldn't help himself but address it in the style of the bully. And this is why we have to talk about what he said rather than just the things that he does, because there are a few lines that still matter. I've spoken before here about the democratic decline that we're seeing in the world, about how the election of Trump, based on his recent announcements, suggests that America is about to embrace the mindset change that Vladimir Putin has been trying to bring about. The American world order, put in place post-World War II, was meant to be the rules-based order, where there were standards like self-determination, national boundaries being inviolable, and so on. Yes, we're all aware America didn't always live up to those ideals in practice. The principle stands regardless. Putin's Russia, however, believes in the might makes right world of the rest of human history before that. In particular, the right of the great powers, what he describes as the sovereign nations, to impose their will on their neighbours and to carve up spheres of influence at will with the other great powers, or maybe fight them for them. If they're too weak to resist such bullying, then you don't count as a sovereign nation, in Putin's definition. Trump's recent comments are therefore not simply extreme positions to be rolled back through negotiation. They're an explicit shift of the United States' perspective on the world to promote the value of expansionism and the use of force just because America can. Negotiating down from a statement like, for instance, NATO members will have to pay more for defence, or the US will leave the alliance, that's one thing. It's kind of an extreme position, but it's entirely within the rules of how that world was meant to work. Negotiating down from the explicit threat to use force to take the territory of another country, that still leaves the Overton window of what is considered acceptable or possible significantly wider than it was. And of course, it is the best present for Putin, the total validation of his invasion of Ukraine. Because what's source for Trumpland, formerly known as Greenland, is surely source for Greater Russia. Except that while if the US did invade Greenland, it would be the shortest war in history, be the sort of special military operation that Putin thought his foray into Ukraine was going to be, because there are no forces stationed there capable of fighting back, unless you count the existing American base. But that's not the only factor. Russia sees itself as having as big a stake in Greenland as its surrounding waters as Trump does. So it's not simply going to cut a quid pro quo on this one. Unsurprising, then, that Kremlin mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov said that Russia is closely monitoring the situation and stating that the Arctic is in Russia's sphere of national and strategic interests. Now, this is exactly the risk you run when you choose to deliberately destabilize an existing delicate status quo, because actions provoke reactions. Norway is now worried that its own Svalbard Islands in the far north could become the focus for Putin in reaction to this. Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Store pronounced this week, "Svalbard is Norway and Svalbard is safe." Svalbard, famously home to more polar bears than people, lies along a sea route that Russia's Northern Fleet has to pass. Its natural resources are available by treaty for 48 countries to exploit. Right now, only Norway and Russia does so. In the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Norway started blocking Russian ships to comply with economic sanctions. The Kremlin did not take that well. In 2024, Russia planted Russian flags in the Russian-settled Svalbard towns of Barentsburg and Pyramiden and said it was going to open a new research centre. So sure, Norway says a thing, but they're saying it because they know full well that a move like this by Trump provokes the other side and they are vulnerable. Tor Wig from the Department of Political Science at the University of Oslo put it like this: "We should be worried that Svalbard may be used as a bargaining chip in deal-making relating to Arctic security. When the United States does not respect international treaties, which Trump shows in his comments re Greenland, this puts everything into play." In other words, it invites the scenario where Trump and Putin negotiate how they will carve up those areas of strategic interest with no regard for the nations and for the people who actually live there. It's one reason why European politicians sought to shut down such talk immediately, even though they'd also largely been saying that they would respond to actions, not words. The EU Foreign Affairs Chief, Kaja Kallas, hit back, saying, "We have to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Greenland." French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot said there is obviously no question that the European Union would let other nations of the world attack its sovereign borders. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz also stood up for the fading old order by saying borders must not be moved by force. This is an existential question for NATO because, of course, Greenland, as a territory of Denmark, is a member of NATO, which means that in theory, if the US did use military force against it, the other members of NATO would be obliged to intervene, regardless of the fact there's pretty much zero chance of that actually happening in practice. This would already have blown up the US membership of NATO, because never mind Article 5, the commitment to collective defence, Article 1 lays down that all members of NATO agree to refrain from using force in international relations in ways that are inconsistent with the United Nations purposes. So some have been saying, no, we have to be clear, this is a line that cannot be crossed, even by threats that may turn out not to be followed up by action in practice, because the threats themselves are enough to destabilize the fragile balance and provoke reactions from geopolitical rivals. Others have been holding on to the line that, it's all just Trump saying random stuff, not to be taken seriously. Outgoing Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that it was an idea that was obviously one that's not going to happen. The UK, which has been trying with some degree of desperation to hold on to the idea it may have good relations with the Trump administration, trying to keep that alive through the barrage of attacks against them from Trump ally Elon Musk pretty much every day. They basically did the same. Foreign Secretary David Lammy played it down.
Do you think that's classic Donald Trump?
Yes, I do think it's classic.
It's not something that worries you?
It's classic Donald Trump.
So the rhetoric, though, in the meantime, you wouldn't condemn. Obviously, the actions you would if it got to that.
I'm not in the business of condemning our closest ally.
Amongst those not downplaying the comments, unsurprisingly, is the political leadership of Denmark and Greenland. The weird thing about it is that relations between Denmark and the US over Greenland had been generally considered to be very open and positive. They already, after all, host a major US military base there, and even while repeating that Greenland is not for sale, they made it clear they were open to constructive discussions about America's security concerns. The Danish Foreign Minister, Lars Rasmussen, said, "We are open to a dialogue with the Americans on how we can possibly cooperate even more closely than we do to ensure that the American ambitions are fulfilled." Indeed, according to the Financial Times, there have been discussions in recent years about building up the US military presence on the island, maybe with a second military base. Several years ago, a Greenlandic minister said they would be happy to see more US forces, describing them as reassuring. You would think that was the easiest win in the world, to embrace that opportunity to develop a further presence in the region with the willing support of a NATO ally, rather than doing what Trump actually did, say that the US would hit Denmark with steep tariffs if it didn't give up the territory, which would mean that all those obese Americans will be paying more for their Ozempic in the future, I guess. To drive the point home, the very next day, Trump's eldest son, Donald Trump Jr., visited Greenland, supposedly in a personal capacity, to be met by a number of supporters who had all had MAGA hats distributed to them for a photo shoot, which is pretty in-your-face and bombastic, you might say weirdly, counterproductively provocative. Claiming that the people of a territory you said you might invade, actually they all really want you to take them over. It's kind of from the Putin playbook, which is to say that it's what empire builders through history have tended to do. Now, it's not to say you can't find plenty of Greenlanders who resent the status quo of being an overseas territory of Denmark. Greenland only gained home rule in 1979, self-government in 2009, and it's been pushing for greater independence. Such calls driven by the memories of Denmark's colonial legacy over the island. For instance, the forced contraceptive scandal of the 1960s and 1970s, where Greenlandic women were subjected to forced sterilization. Not something that fades quickly from the collective memory. Now, pushing back the other way is the territory's dependence on significant quantities of Danish financial resources. But whatever the Greenlanders might wish for themselves, they are becoming aware that they are rapidly the point of focus in an increasingly dangerous world. It's not wholly new, hence why America has a base there already. That base, in the far north of the country, is part of Washington's early warning system, should Russian missiles be heading its way. But as climate change is reducing the amount of sea ice at the North Pole, Russia, China, and America all have their eyes on the opening up of new trade routes. Yes, Trump will dismiss climate change as a green scam when he's looking for excuses to support oil and coal, but he will happily accept the logic of what's actually happening when it seems as though America's enemies are about to take advantage of it. Russia's Putin has had his eyes on a new northern sea route that would cut the time it takes to ship goods from China to Europe via a route very much within Russia's geographical sphere of influence. Hence Russia's ongoing work to construct a new class of nuclear-powered icebreakers that will be the largest on Earth, able to extend the season that such a route would be open in the early years. For its part, China announced 6 years ago the Polar Silk Road, its own plan to open up trading and energy routes across the region. Chinese energy companies have been taking major stakes in Siberian gas projects and investing in port infrastructure. The other attraction is the potential for mineral mining on Greenland, which also becomes easier as the ice sheets melt. Now, it's early days for this. Chinese firms are champing at the bit, but progress has been slow because the ice needs to melt a bit more. Is Trump that bothered about something that will only truly become viable on a timescale of decades? Maybe yes, if early action is needed to prevent the other side from putting themselves into an advantageous position. Hence Trump's intent to make a move to block them off. Michael O'Hanlon, Director of Research in the Foreign Policy Programme at the Brookings Institution, told Politico that US strategy for the Arctic to date had been less about aggressively pursuing exclusive American access, more about preventing Russia or China from blocking other people's access to the Arctic, in the way that China's been trying to do in the South China Sea. So you might consider that if Trump was really to follow through and to start trying to achieve exclusivity for the US, it might not be other NATO members fighting back that would be the concern, but Russian and Chinese agents who place a high strategic priority on their own interests in the region. China and Russia see the coming of the might makes right world as their time, the decline of the democracies, the decline of America, and the rise of the autocracies. So they're not going to simply roll their eyes and say, well, Trump says we can't take advantage of this highly strategic resource, so I guess that's that. Going back to the degree of capitulation America seems to be making to this different world order, it's worth noting just how enthusiastically MAGA world grasped this new expansionist vision of America, having been talking just yesterday, metaphorically, about how the good thing about Trump is he'd be focused on, bringing prices down for Americans, not starting new wars. Well, that moved pretty damn quickly to the line that, of course, America should take over Canada and Greenland and the Panama Canal. When Trump said he wouldn't start new wars, he just meant he wouldn't start new wars against people capable of fighting back. Think I'm kidding? Straight after Trump's press conference, the Republican majority on the House Foreign Affairs Committee tweeted this: "Our country was built by warriors and explorers. We tamed the West, won 2 world wars, and were the first to plant our flag on the moon. President Trump has the biggest dreams for America, and it's un-American to be afraid of big dreams." Do we see how quickly people line up behind the current source of power to accept at face value whatever has to be accepted to become part of that winning team? Do we think there might be historical parallels for that process in action? In the meantime, Trump has said that he will meet Vladimir Putin where he imagines he will be able to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine. When he does so, he might also discover the depth of Russia's opposition to his stated plans in the North Atlantic, perhaps leading up to that carving up negotiation I mentioned earlier. But we'll see. Eventually. Don't imagine we'll get much of a frank and open readout of what gets discussed at such a meeting in the short term. Donald Trump has not yet taken office, but his looming arrival has already marked a major change in the world of geopolitics. It will be interesting to see how quickly the different leaders and nations of the world adapt to this new, let's face it, relatively brutal logic of how things are going to work in the future. The consequences of this week will be measured in decades, not just on the standard US electoral cycle.